Welcome back. In today's lecture, we are going to be talking about the question about the idea of what is truth. And as we're going into this lecture, one of the most important aspects of this lecture is certainly going to be trying to get a grasp on some of the fundamentals of logic. Now, we're not going to go into tremendous depth on in logical thinking. I teach logic classes as well, and we don't need to go massively into depth of logical thought, but we do need some of the basics here because it's going to help us to understand and to think about moral guidelines later on as well. And so today, trying to get some of the basics of logic, and then also let me say kind of quickly that with the title, What is Truth? I understand that many of my students aren't going to believe in truth. And in fact, when I was in college, I didn't believe in truth either. And it's one of the things that some of this information, it really made me think. It made me think in a new way about some of my most basic fundamental thoughts. And as we go through the lecture, I'll even tell you some of the changes that I made when I was in college based on some of the information that I'm about to give you today. Doesn't mean you have to change your mind. It just means that I did. And hopefully as we go through it, you'll understand this information, and then maybe that'll help your thinking as well. Help in the sense of that you'll be able to think about your own thinking more clearly. I'm not going to tell you what to think or what to believe, but I do want to help you as you're thinking, and that's really what this lecture is really geared specifically for and designed for. All right. So one of the most important things as you're trying to have any type of thinking or thoughtful conversation is that you've got to have a foundation for thinking, and that's what logic is. It's the foundation for thinking. One of the second things we need to understand kind of quickly here is what a truth claim is, because I'm going to talk a lot about this is a truth claim, right? So what is a truth claim? And really, a truth claim can be it can be any statement that is asserted as being the case. It does not have to be true, right? Now, that's one of the tougher pieces of this, right? A truth claim does not have to be true in order for it to be a truth claim. It's just a claim of that this is the case. So if I claimed that I am, in fact, a pizza, that's a truth claim. It is not true, but it is a claim of truth. It's a claim about something. It's a declaration that, in this case, I am proclaiming myself to be a pizza. It's not true, but it's still a truth claim, okay? Now, so other truth claims could be something like the moon is made of cheese, the earth is flat. All of those are claims about the shape of the earth or the substance that the moon is made of. So those things are truth claims. They're a declaration about the way things are. So when it comes to the question then, what is truth? That's very different than a truth claim. What is truth is trying to get to things that actually are the case, not just that they're claimed to be the case, but that they are in fact the case. And so in my case, if I declared that I am a Homo sapien, then that would be accurate. That would be true. And so it's different than just a truth claim. A truth claim can be anything in the sense of that this individual is really believing it to be the case as opposed to something that genuinely is the case. And so that's kind of what we're going to be making distinctions of here today. Sounds fairly simple. Promise you it gets more complicated. There are, as it turns out, many kinds of truths. And again, here I know that some of you aren't going to believe in truth, but think about it for just a moment. Aren't there historical truths? Isn't it just the case that George Washington was the first president of the United States? Isn't it true that, in this case, that 2 + 2 = 4? That's a mathematical truth. And so right away we see that there are some things that are true. There's historical truths, and there are mathematical truths, and there are also now, even as we're talking about this, there's logical truths, and we'll talk about those as we get into the basics of logic here. There are personal truths as well. You have parents. You may not have ever met your parents. You may not like your parents, but the simple fact is that everybody's got, a mom and a dad. There is a day that you were born on. Even if you were born, right at the stroke of whatever, there's still a day that you were born on, and those things are true. They're true about you in a personal way, but they're still a truth. And so some things really are true. And so I know that a lot of my students, again, I held this position for quite a while as well, they say there's no such thing as truth. And very quickly we can see that no, there are some things that are in fact true. And so in this case, there's personal truths as well. There are scientific truths. If you don't think that's the case, then, well, defy gravity and, give that your best shot. There are scientific truths. There's something called metaphysics, and there are things that are metaphysically true. There are judicial truths, meaning that there are laws, and those laws here are in place. And so there are also theological truths. Now, theology is just the study of God. Theo is Godology is study. So there are theological truths. Most fundamentally, as we talked about in the last lecture, either there is a God or there is not a God. And that's a theological truth. There is one or there isn't one. It's a theological truth that God either exists or doesn't exist. So right away we see that, yeah, there are lots of things that are true. Most individuals who make the claim that there's no such thing as truth haven't really thought it fully through. They haven't really sat down and fully developed what it is that they're thinking, right? Sure, there's some things that are true, but what we're after when we talk about truth is big T truth. Are there any truths that are true for kind of everybody that really just are the case? And so big T, right, not a small t truth. So a small t truth for me is that Brussels sprouts are better than chocolate. That's a small truth. That's a personal truth that's true to me, and it's true for me, but I anticipate that for most of my students that's not the case, right? But it's still true for me. Well, that's a small t truth. Big T truth is a truth that's true for everyone, and it really just is the case, okay? Now, in order to fully understand what truth is, it's helpful to start out by talking about what truth is not, okay? And so we're going to walk through a number of things here that are hopefully going to help us understand that truth is, it's not this, and it's not this, and it's not this. And hopefully after we chip away from everything that truth is not, we'll be left with something that truth is, and then we can kind of see it. Okay, so first of all, truth is not what works. Just because something brings the desired end, that doesn't mean that it is true. Right now I'm going to give you kind of an example here to help you understand what that means. In years past, there were two competing theories about how the solar system worked. There was what's called the geocentric theory of the solar system, and that is the theory that the Earth is at the center of the solar system and everything else goes around it. So geo just means Earth, centric in the center, right? And then there was also the heliocentric theory of the solar system, and helio there meaning the sun, that the sun was the center of the solar system and everything else went around it. Now, in that case, when it came to successfully navigating at sea, let's say that you were trying to transport goods from, say, Egypt to Rome, it didn't matter which theory of the universe you accept, the theory of the solar system that you accepted as true, whether you thought the Earth was the center or you thought the sun was the center, you could successfully navigate from Egypt to Rome, and it didn't matter which theory you thought was accurate. You could still use the stars to guide yourself. Both theories worked when it came to navigating at sea, but that didn't mean both theories were true. It wasn't the case that the Earth was the center of the solar system and the sun was the center of the solar system at the same time, and just for different people based on the fact that they thought that it was one way or the other. It worked perfectly fine for both of them. They could both successfully navigate at sea, but that didn't mean that both concepts were true. And so just because a truth claim works, that doesn't mean it's true, right? So that's the first thing truth is not. Truth is not what coheres. Just because you have a set of statements that adhere, that they seem to be all agreeing and saying the same thing, that doesn't make it true, right? You can have sets of statements that cling together, but that aren't necessarily true, right? And so, for example, all wives are married women. That statement is true, but it's empty because it doesn't really tell us anything about reality. The two statements cohere. Wives just are defined as married women, but that's not helpful. That's not really a truth. And in fact, that could come to not be the case. There is an old poem about Mary, the mother of Jesus, and in the poem, Mary was called silly. And I remember as I was looking at this poem, I'm thinking, oh, who has ever described Mary as being silly? And then you did some etymology on the word. I went back and I looked at it and I saw that silly used to mean blessed, and that word has changed. So the meaning of the word silly changed from blessed to what we have today. And so again, those definitions of words can change, and so you can't have that kind of big T truth simply based on how a word is defined. Again, truth is not necessarily what coheres. If you ask any police officer, they're going to tell you immediately, very, very quickly, that just because a group of witnesses agree on what happened on a set of events, that doesn't mean that it was necessarily true, and for a number of reasons. In fact, if police officers are interrogating a group of witnesses, and if all of their statements cohere really, really closely, they become suspicious and they think that they're lying. Because if there's an extraordinary situation, if somebody comes running out of a building and somebody's chasing them, shooting at them, because that's a highly intense situation, not everyone's mind is going to record the events as exactly in the same way. And so what you'll do is you'll talk to one individual and they'll have one story, and another individual will have a slightly different story. Now, one of them's not going to say we were in California and the other person's not going to say we were in New York. And no, it's not that kind of difference, but the details are going to be slightly different, right? And so if you get a set of individuals who witness a situation like that, you don't expect that the facts, that the basic information will cohere perfectly, because people don't record facts in the same way, especially under intense circumstances. So if it does cohere too closely, they think what they're hearing is probably a lie. If it coheres basically and they can get a basic story out of that, then they think that it might be true because there's enough difference to make them wonder that maybe these individuals really are being honest. They're being truthful about what they saw. But if it coheres too closely together, then they begin to become suspicious and think it's a lie. Just because things cohere, just because information or facts cohere, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the case. It doesn't mean that it's true. There are other examples that we see from science. The idea that just because things, actually I'm going to talk about that again in just a minute, so I'm going to wait for that one. Okay. Also, truth is not what is comprehensive, all right? Just because a view or an explanation for a given set of data, just because it incorporates all of the information, that doesn't mean that that position is true, right? Just because it takes all the information and it explains all of the information, it doesn't mean that that position is true. And so truth is not necessarily what's comprehensive of all the data. So for example, imagine that you parked in the parking lot at college and you came out, you went into class. When you came back out, you found that your window was smashed out, that there was a long, like somebody had keyed your car, and that the iPod that you had foolishly left inside on the seat was stolen. What you might think was true, what you might think was the case, was that someone came along, saw the iPod, smashed your windows, stole it, and then also keyed your car just because, there you have it, a little bit of extra damage just because, right? That explains all of the information. That's comprehensive of all of the facts of the situation. It explains the smashed window, the missing iPod, and the scratch mark down the side of your car. But when you pull up the security camera, what you find, in fact, is that there were two separate incidents. First of all, your ex came along and found your car, and they keyed your car, and then you find that a few minutes later, a thief came along, smashed the window, and stole the iPod. So, what you originally thought was the case was not in fact the case. What you believed was comprehensive. It included all of the data, but it was in fact not what had happened. So just because a theory is comprehensive, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is true. It just means that it explains all the data. There could be other explanations. In fact, when I'm in class, I outline a number of explanations where, maybe a group of aliens came down and decided that they wanted the music that you had on your iPod, and so that they, bumped into your car with their spaceship, smashed the window, and stole it. It could be that a squirrel did it. It could be that a lawnmower threw the rock and you forgot your iPod and it's actually back at home. It could be that your iPod, contained some music that was really, really offensive to the iPod itself, and rather than stay there and continue its miserable existence with that god-awful music that you have on there, it threw itself out of the window and, ran away or something like that. There's any number of different explanations that could be the case. Just because it's comprehensive, that doesn't mean that it's true. So comprehensiveness does not equal truth. The next couple are a little bit more difficult for most people. The first one being less difficult, hopefully, for most of us, and then the second one being the really challenging one. So, truth is not what feels good. Just because something feels good or feels bad, that doesn't mean it's true. It just means that you have a particular aversion to it, meaning you don't like it, or that you have a particular attraction to that particular idea. That doesn't mean it's true. There's plenty of things out there that I don't like that are true. And so your feelings about something do not cause it to be true or false. Now, if it were the case that your feelings actually determine truth, I wouldn't be able to give my students bad grades, because they make almost nobody feel good about themselves. And if it were just simply the case of that I want to get a good grade, then, well, truth is not what makes you feel good. Just because you like it, that doesn't mean it's true. And for one of the really good examples of this, I turn very quickly to Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy is an individual who kidnapped and raped and murdered, I think, around 17 victims, I believe in California and then also in Florida. I promise you that his actions, his activities felt good to him. He was doing it because he liked it, because he thought that, because of what it was doing for him. It felt good, but did that make it necessarily true or right? Is it the right thing to do? Just because something makes you feel good, does that mean that it's good or right or wrong? Our truth it can't simply be based on feeling. There's got to be more to it than simply the fact of that it makes you feel good. There is a flat earth society both in England and also in California. Both of these societies arguing for the fact that the earth is indeed flat. Okay? And if that's what they happen to think, or if it makes them feel good, that doesn't mean it's true. It just means that they happen to think one way about it. Okay. The second one, or I'm sorry, now it's number 5, but the second one I was talking about from a moment ago. This one's harder for most people, and you shouldn't mistake this one as for the one that I've just talked about, feelings. Just because you feel good or bad about something, that doesn't necessarily make it true. And in fact, the shape of the earth should be moved down into this particular one that I'm talking about. So there, truth is not what feels good. Here, truth is not relative to the person. Now, this is the one that I believed when I was in college. I thought truth was relative to the person. So if you believed something was true with all your heart, then it was in fact true for you. And as I was introduced to some of this information, I began to wonder if that could be the case. I began to wonder if what I believed was true because of my belief. And that was the position that I was in when it wasn't the position I held And I took a philosophy class in college, and when I came out, it was the position that I held, that truth was relative to the person. And then later on, I was introduced to further philosophical study, and I began to question that. I began to wonder if that was true, and here's some of the information as to why. All right, so truth is not relative to the person. That shouldn't be confused with the last thing we were talking about, where it was feelings-based. Here, instead, truth is evaluated based on a person's belief. Just because a person believes something, that doesn't make it true. And here's where the Flat Earth Society actually belongs. Just because someone believes that the Earth is flat does not mean that the Earth is in fact flat. It might be true to them. Now, there's a massive distinction in the phrase, something's true to you, as opposed to something is true for you. If something's true to you, you believe that it's true. To you, that's true. But just because you believe that something is true, that doesn't mean it's true for you. It doesn't mean that somehow it really is the case. Someone who believes that the Earth is flat does not cause the Earth to be flat. The Earth is not flat for them. It does not become flat for them. It simply is still the shape that it actually is. It doesn't become flat because they believe that it's flat. To them, it's true. But it's not true for them. It is true to them. It's not true for them. And the distinction there is massive. Now, imagine that someone else believes that Santa brought them presents. It might be true to them, but it's not true for them. And hopefully I'm not, giving away, some tremendous truth here about Santa Claus's existence, hopefully. But just because you believe it, that doesn't make it true. In the in the medieval world, some people believed that rats sprang spontaneously from dirty rags that were piled in the corner, meaning that the rags were over there and that they didn't see rats going into the piles of dirty clothes, but they would see rats coming out. And so what they thought was that the rags themselves caused rats to spontaneously come into existence. Now, we know today that that's not the case. Dirty rags in the corner don't cause rats to come into existence spontaneously, but to those individuals, that was true. It was true to them, but it wasn't true for them. That wasn't the way that nature behaved at all. So just because you believe something, that doesn't mean it's true. It just means you believe that it's true, right? So truth is not relative to the person. Things don't literally become true because you believe that they are that way, right? Now, if you think it does, that you do determine reality simply based on the fact of that you believe something, I'd give you a couple challenges. Number one, drop out of college. You don't need to come here and waste your time and waste your money. All you need to do is believe that you have a degree, and then you'll have the degree, and you won't need to go through all this struggle. And if you can figure out how to do that, let me know, because I'd like to take on 7 or 8 more degrees, and I can just believe that it's true, and then, hey, what do you know, I'll have them. There's no point in earning one. Here, and then another example, here, what I always tell my students is that when it comes to determining reality, when it comes to determining truth, and this is really rude, but it's really true, your belief counts for nothing. It counts for nothing. And neither does mine. Nobody's belief determines reality. If you could simply believe things into being the case, then you're not a human. You're a god of some sort. If your own ideas can simply determine that reality is this way, you're not what we are. You're something vastly more powerful and far more advanced than anything else that lives on this earth, at least that we're understanding here as being flesh and blood, right? I mean, if you can do that, you're a deity. So our belief doesn't cause things to be true. Now, kind of as a further challenge and as a further example here, I like to tell my students a story about one of the experiences I had when I was working on my master's degree. While I was working on my master's, I had to engage with a number of different religions and different ideas. One of the classes that I took was world religions, but then also cults and occults, right? And within those classes, any number of different religions was brought up and studied. So I kind of have a background in some of that information. And one of the religious perspectives that I studied there was called Christian Science. Okay, now that's not Scientology. That's a different one over here, right? And then there's something called Christian Science. And Christian Science is it was a religious perspective that was developed out of Christianity. That's why it's called Christian Science. We'll kind of see why in a moment. It was developed by a lady by the name of Mary Baker Eddy in the 1800s. And Mary Baker Eddy believed kind of the foundational, right? We should understand what that is now. The foundational fundamental belief, the underlying foundation for her belief system was that evil did not exist. There's no such thing as evil. That the only reason that, I'm going to say bad things happen, and they don't really happen according to Christian Science, the only reason that evil seems to exist, because it doesn't exist according to Christian Science, is because we believe it does. And if we'll simply change our minds, if we'll just change our mindsets and stop believing in evil things won't feel like, they won't be part of our lives, because they really don't exist. And so all you have to do, and this is kind of their phrase, right? All you have to do is get your mind right, and then you'll understand there is no evil, and in fact there won't be evil in your life. So for a Christian Science person, they don't go to hospitals or visit doctors. Why not? Because there's no such thing as evil, and that means there's no such thing as sickness. Sickness does not exist. And so rather than go to the doctor to try to get healing from a non-existent disease, you just have to get your mind right. And once you realize there's no such thing as cancer, or there's no such thing as a cold, then it isn't there, because it never was there to begin with. So in studying this particular worldview, this particular religion, one of my assignments was to visit their house of worship, and then to write a paper on that experience. And so I took a couple of friends with me, because I really didn't want to go by myself. And I went into their house of worship, and it really looked like any other Christian church that, if you've ever been to any kind of Christian church, not so much the modern stuff that we're seeing now, not the modern updated music, but something more like you might have experienced in the 1940s and 50s. It was a little more old school. That's really what it looked like. In fact, a lot of the hymns, they had a hymnal there, and they sang a number of songs. And I think many of them, some of you, if you've been part of a more traditional service, you'd probably recognize some of the songs. Their interpretation of the song is going to be different, but it's basically the same song. They are Christian scientists, right? They're Christian Science. So after some of the songs were sung, there was a testimony. They gave testimonies. There wasn't really a speaker per se, not a pastor or preacher. They had elders or deacons, people who led the church, but nobody got up and spoke. Again, they just gave testimony. So people would stand up there where they were sitting and talk about something, some experience they'd had through the week, or update, themselves or their family or whatever. And so just for a couple of examples, stories that you might have heard there, too, that I heard. One fellow, probably in his 40s, he stands up, and he said, Thursday night, I woke up at about 2 o'clock in the morning, and I thought I had a toothache. But I knew that there was no such thing as evil, and so I got my mind right, and the toothache went away because it was never there to begin with, right? So rather than go see a dentist for something that might be wrong with his tooth, he just got his mind right. And of course it was gone, because it was never there to begin with. And then another lady stood up. She's probably in her 80s. She was quite a bit older. She stood up and said, pray for my daughter. She thinks she has cancer right now. She thinks she has cancer, not she has cancer, but rather she thinks she does. And if she'll just get her mind right, the cancer will be gone, because there was never any cancer there to begin with. And so as long as you get your mind right, your belief is going to determine reality around you. It's going to determine for you the truth of the matter of your toothache or the cancer or whatever else. Now, I know I was taking some notes there. I had a notebook. There was probably only 50, maybe 60 people in the church. They all knew that we were visitors. They all knew why we were there because, they were used to people who were working on degrees, coming in and visiting. Christian Science isn't it doesn't have a large number of churches and a large number of followers anymore. They're still around, but not a huge number. So they're used to that. They knew why we were there, and they were very gracious. They were great people. They all came up to us afterward and, shook our hands and, just small talk. And then afterward, I had a chance to stand in the foyer with two of the deacons, with my friends still there, the five of us, and we were having a conversation about their beliefs, because I had read quite a bit about their history and their basic ideas. And so I was asking them, just trying to get clarification on some of those things. As I was talking to them, and we probably talked for about 15 minutes, but the whole time I was talking to them, there was something gnawing in the back of my head. It was like, there's something right in front of you that you need to ask. There's something that you're not seeing that you obviously need to inquire about. And it took me the whole 15 minutes of really trying to pull this thing to the front of my mind so I could figure out what it was I wanted to ask these two gentlemen. And about 15 minutes in, I realized what it was, and it hit me so hard, and I realized immediately that if I asked this question, it could be offensive. And so I listened to the end of that answer. I took my notes, and then I kind of stepped back and put up my hands. I was like, I don't want to offend you guys. You're really great people. But I've got a question that I really am dying to ask you. And again, this could be offensive. I don't mean for it to be, right? And I looked at these two fellows and I said, I noticed that both of you are wearing glasses. And I didn't say anything else. I just left it there. And immediately they knew, right? If their fundamental position, if their basic idea here is that your belief determines reality, and if that belief, their fundamental belief for them is that no evil exists, bad eyesight does not exist. They should not be wearing glasses, because all they have to do is get their mind right, and then bad eyesight doesn't exist. And I just made this statement, and I kind of looked at them. Like I said, immediately they understood. And they kind of smiled. They were gracious, really, really wonderful folks. And they just said, our faith isn't big enough. And for me, because I wasn't there to argue, I was there to learn, I simply left it at that. I mean, that's where they are in their faith, is that their faith isn't big enough. They can't take off their glasses because that bad eyesight, they don't have the ability to overcome that doubt, and that they don't have faith enough to simply remove them and still function. The reason it's called Christian Science was that, according to Mary Baker Eddy's teachings, she's the founder, according to her teachings, Jesus was the ultimate person. He was the ultimate got your mind right human, okay? So the reason that Jesus could heal the sick was because Jesus understood that there was no such thing as sickness. There is no such thing as blindness. That's evil. It doesn't exist. And Jesus' mind was so right that all he had to do was lay hands on an individual or speak over an individual, and their physical illness, or that physical evil that seemed to be part of that person's physical life, would be removed from their mind, and therefore it would be removed from their body because it never had existed in the first place. And so that's why Jesus could heal. It's because he could get other people's minds right, because he was just that ultimate. And he was in fact so ultimate that's why he seemed to have come back from the dead. He didn't come back from the dead because death is evil, and since death is evil, it doesn't exist. And since it doesn't exist, and he got his mind so right, he never died. That's why he seemed to have come back to life, because he never died in the first place. And so he's the ultimate got your mind right. So I tell that story, and then as I finish the story and I look around the room, a lot of my students are either kind of smiling or rolling their eyes or shaking their head. Wow, how can anybody believe that it's just the case that, if you don't believe in cancer, there's no cancer, or if you don't believe in bad eyesight, how can anyone possibly believe that their own belief, causes these things not to exist? Well, if you think that it's silly for someone who believes in Christian Science to think that their beliefs with regard to cancer can't cure cancer, isn't it also equally silly for you to think that your belief causes reality to be what it is? If it's silly for them to believe that their belief causes reality, then it's equally silly for you to believe that your belief causes reality to be what it is. If their belief can't change reality, neither can yours. And so if you're wondering how anyone can think that, then shouldn't you be wondering how you, if you do think this, shouldn't you be wondering how you think your thought and beliefs change reality? Isn't it equally silly to believe that your beliefs determine reality? What we're talking about here is called relativism. It's called cultural relativism. That is to say that truth is relative to the person, and truth is, it's up to everyone to make up their mind, and whatever they believe, that makes it true for them. But if that's the case, then those who believe in Christian Science are equally as right as anyone else who doesn't believe in Christian Science. And if you're thinking that that's a silly belief, then isn't it equally silly for any of us and all of us to think that our beliefs cause things to be true? Now, our culture is highly influenced by this idea of relativism. It's in the minds of many of my students, and it was in my mind as well. When I was in college, I came to believe that that was the case, and it was through different experiences and the study of logic that I began to question whether relativism could possibly be true, whether it could possibly be the case. If it's the case that each and every one determines reality based on their beliefs, then sign me up for Christian Science, because I could rid myself of allergies or the common cold or knee and ankle injuries. I could even rid myself of death and the death of my loved ones. My goodness. But if it simply seems to be utterly ridiculous that we could change reality based on that, then again, relativism is at least suspect. It's something that needs to be considered. And like I said, it is rampant in our culture. I was someone who believed in it. I did change my mind, and it was very difficult. And it took me a lot of time. And in fact, what I found was that as I was changing my mind, I would have to often turn around and remind myself of why I was changing my mind, because I would find myself kind of slipping back into relativism. But as I walked through the arguments again, I began to think, no, that can't be right because of these things, because of these things, and because of these things. Because some things are relative, because some things are relative, because some things are, true because, you believe them to be the case. They are true for you, and they're true to you. Both that's correct. My belief that Brussels sprouts are better than chocolate is a relative belief. But just because some things are relatively true, they're relativistically true, that doesn't mean everything's relativistically true. That's making the wrong kind of logical move. Because some things are relative, therefore all things are relative. Because some truths are relative doesn't mean that all truths are relative. Learning to distinguish between truths that are relative versus truths that are not relative can be a difficult thing to do, but it's simply not the case that all truths are relative simply because some are. It's difficult to do, and that's one of the reasons I think many people don't try to change the worldview is because it is so daunting, it is so difficult, and because it's going to lead to a lot of work. Because once I began thinking of things as not all truth being relative, I began to have to ask my question, well, what truths are relative? And that led to a lot of research and a lot of study and a lot of, thinking and a lot of reflection and trying to discover, if there are these truths that aren't relative, what are they? And then what can we know, and what should we base other actions on based on the things that might be true in a non-relativistic manner. It's difficult to do. It requires a lot of work. Some people just don't want to have to do that. I understand, but it is certainly something that can benefit your life and can benefit especially your thinking, your ability to sit down and think about the world around you. Okay, so that's several things that truth is not. Then now, two things that truth is, and the first one's pretty simple. This is called the correspondence theory, and in this case we say truth is what corresponds with reality. Now, what does that mean? Well, for example, you can't use examples in your writing. I can, as I'm doing a lecture. So, truth is what corresponds with reality. What that means is that if a belief matches up with something, with the world and the way it actually is, that belief corresponds to the way things actually are, and it's true. So, for example, if you believe there's not milk in a refrigerator, and if I believe there is milk in that same refrigerator, right, whichever one of our beliefs corresponds with the fact of actual existence of milk in the refrigerator or not existence of milk in the refrigerator, that person's right. So the truth of the matter is what corresponds with the existence of, in this case, the milk in the refrigerator. The correspondence theory works great for physical objects. It helps us a lot. So, for example, the shape of the earth. Whoever's belief lines up with the reality of the shape of the earth, their belief corresponds with reality and it is true. Okay? So if it's the case that the earth is a cone, is cone-shaped, then whoever believes that the earth is cone-shaped, their belief lines up with the reality. It corresponds with the reality of the fact of the shape of the earth, and therefore their belief is true. Now, if a person believes that the earth is a cylinder, and in fact it's a cone, if they believe it's a cylinder and in fact it's a cone, their belief does not correspond with reality, and therefore it's false. It's wrong. It's a false belief, right? So that's the correspondence theory. Not overly difficult, helpful with physical objects, not really helpful with non-physical objects, or what we call metaphysical objects, right? It's not going to be tremendously helpful for those things. Is there anything in particular that can be helpful for us when it comes to a non-physical object? Is there some type of truth, some type of logical something that can help us understand and be useful when it comes to determining the truth of non-physical objects? There is, as it turns out, something quite useful. But in order to get to the one that we need, we're going to have to do one that's much simpler. Aristotle gives us 6 what he calls first principles, meaning that these things come first, these principles are the first ones, and that according to his thinking and according to his, the way he lays these things out, these things come first. And if we understand them, then that'll lead us to other things. That's why they're called first principles. The first principle, the beginning first principle, is the principle that B is. Now, what that means is that something exists. So B could be anything. It could be like in algebra where we used to solve for x, or at least I used to solve for x. X, in that case, could be anything. We didn't necessarily know what it was, but there has to be something. Aristotle's first principle is that something has to exist. There is something that exists. Even if all of this, even if everything around us and everything that we know and experience and on a daily basis, even if all of that is really just a dream, it simply is the case that something exists, meaning that there must be a dreamer having the dream. Even if this is not real, there is something real that's out there that's doing the dreaming in this case. So it's not that there's nothing. His first principle states that there is something. Something exists. It's not that there literally is no things in existence. That's his first principle. His second first principle, and it's the one we want, is called the law of non-contradiction. Law of non-contradiction, right? And sometimes it's called just the law of contradiction too. You can go it either way, it doesn't matter. But I always call it the law of non-contradiction, and I'll abbreviate it sometimes in my writing as just the LON, and sometimes I'll say the LON because I get tired of saying law of non-contradiction. So it's just the law of non-contradiction, or the LON. Right, so the LON is the principle that B is not non-B. Now, B can be anything, just like we talked about, but B is X, so solving for X. B is not non-B. What that means is that something is not both what it is and the opposite of what it is at the same time. It's not possible, it's illogical for something to both be what it is and to be not what it is at the same time. So, back to the milk in the refrigerator concept here. It can't be the case, according to the law of non-contradiction, that two people who hold opposing beliefs are both at the same time correct. If you have two opposite beliefs, one of them must be false. Okay? So if you believe that there is milk in the fridge and I believe that there is not milk in the fridge, the law of non-contradiction tells us that we can't both be right because we believe opposing or opposite ideas. Since we believe opposing and opposite ideas, one of us must be right and the other must be wrong. It's not possible that we're both right at the same time. And then there's a little caveat, and in the same relationship, right? But for us, just at the same time. We can't both be right at the same time. In the same relationship, meaning that I could both be, say, a father and a son at the same time, because those are two different relationships that I have, one with my father and another with my child. And so it can be the case that I am both a father and a son. Both those things are true, even though they're opposite of each other, but because the relationship with the people is different, they're not opposing. Those are not opposite ideas. An opposite idea, an opposite concept here, just is the fact of that you believe that there is milk, I believe that there's not milk. We can't both be right, right? If they are opposing beliefs, we can't both be right. So, interestingly, in order to disprove the law of non-contradiction, you have to use it, right? And so, if a student says to me, I disagree with the law of non-contradiction, I'm going to say, I agree with the law of non-contradiction, right? I think it's true. As that turns out, we believe opposing ideas. The student believing that the law of non-contradiction is not true is the opposite of my belief, which is that the law of non-contradiction is true. And what the student is doing by arguing, no, it isn't true, is that they're saying, I'm right, you're wrong, we're not both right. Both of us can't be right about the truth of the law of non-contradiction. The problem with that is that the student who's claiming that the law of non-contradiction is not true is using the law of non-contradiction to prove the position that the law of non-contradiction is false, which means that they're making an internal logical mistake. If you disbelieve that the law of non-contradiction is true, you have to, if you believe that the law of non-contradiction is not true, you're taking an opposite position from the person who's believing that it is true, and you're making the claim that you can't both be right. Now, if you think you both can be right, then all you have to do is say, I think you're both right. Well, but think about it. Can it be true that the law of non-contradiction is both true and not true at the same time? Doesn't one person have to be right and the other person has to be wrong? It's logical. Since it's logical, then the law of non-contradiction is what's called self-evident. It's self-evidently true. It doesn't have to be proven on anything else by any other means of proof. It's true based on its own merit. And so the law of non-contradiction saying it can't both be true and not true at the same time it stands up under the weight of its own scrutiny. It stands up under its own principle, and it says that's right. And so if you try to argue against it, you actually have to use it. And if you use something in order to win an argument, you shouldn't be arguing against the thing, the rule that you're trying to use in order to win that argument. So the law of non-contradiction proves itself to be true, and therefore it stands up logically under criticism. Okay. Now, with that, with the law of non-contradiction, it's important to understand that the law of non-contradiction can't actually tell us which person is right. All the law of non-contradiction can do is tell us that we can't both be right. So back to the milk in the fridge. The law of non-contradiction says we can't both be right about milk being in the same fridge or not being in that same fridge. All it can do is say we can't both be right. It can't tell us, it can't help us decide who's right about the milk in the fridge. All it can do is say you can't both be right. That's a very, very helpful tool, especially as we begin trying to look at ethics and morality, and as we begin trying to understand how that's going to influence our thinking as we move into a class that really is designed to think about morals. And morality is, thinking about morality is an experience in metaphysics. It's not a physical experience, right? So the correspondence theory isn't necessarily going to help us in the sense of that milk in the fridge, not milk in the fridge, right? We just open the door and then we can see the physical existence or non-existence of milk, and then we have the answer. That's a physical question, a question that can be answered by having an experience in the physical world. Metaphysics means that you're looking at something that doesn't have physical extension. And so the question of morality is something that doesn't have physical extension in the sense of that there is no such thing as physical courage, right? Or physical justice. That doesn't exist. It's a concept. It's a non-physical thing. You can't chop off a slab of justice and throw it in the pan and fry it. That's nothing you can do because justice doesn't have physical extension, right? So it's a metaphysical thing. So the law of non-contradiction can help us with these non-physical things by saying two opposing beliefs can't both at the same time be true. So when it comes to morality, when it comes to ethics, how is that going to be helpful for us? Well, earlier I said that in the last lecture, I said that one of the things we're looking for within morality is we're looking for some kind of foundation that will help us to understand whether or not, that will help us to understand that these things are true based on this foundation, these things are morally right based on this foundation, these things are morally wrong based on this foundation. Is there a foundation for morality? Is that big question. Now, what the law of non-contradiction will help us to do is it will help us to look at that and say, it can't be the case that there is a foundation for morality and there is not a foundation for morality. I'm sorry, I think I said reality that first time. The law of non-contradiction tells us that there can't be a foundation for morality and that there is not a foundation for morality at the same time. Those two truth claims, right there, we're back to truth claims. Those two truth claims are opposite of each other and they're contradictory to each other, and therefore they cannot both be true at the same time and in the same relationship. Either there is a foundation for morality or there is not a foundation for morality. They can't both be true. So that's one of the things that the law of non-contradiction is certainly going to help us with in this particular case. And that leaves us with the question, can there be truth? When it comes to morality and it reaching across culture, can there be truths? Now, there are a number of different options. There are a number of different belief systems here in place that say, yes, there are, or no, there's not, or here's one that could be, or here's one that could be. There's a number of different ones. But part of this lecture really is designed to explore the question of whether or not culture can be a foundation for morality. And so that's kind of where I want to go, because that's where relativism, as we talked about earlier, the idea that whatever you believe is true for you as long as you believe with all your heart is true for you, right? that the idea of relativism, that it's right. Now, there's personal relativism, that what you believe is true for you based on the fact that you believe it, and that's personal, versus cultural relativism, which is much more prevalent. More people believe it. And so within cultural relativism, the idea is that because a culture holds to ideas, then it's true for that culture. And so culturally, these things are true. So, and here again, I want to be careful. Some things are relative to that culture. Remember us talking in one of the previous lectures about how some cultures, their women go topless? Well, that's culturally relative to them and appropriate according to that culture. But just because some things are culturally relative when it comes to morality, does that mean that all things are culturally, morally relative? That it depends on how the culture views it, right? Some things are. I think women going topless is a cultural, moral precept. That's what they believe, and if they do that, okay, that's fine. In their culture, that's fine. Are there any other things that might not be cultural in the sense of that just because a culture believes it or operates according to this particular paradigm, does that necessarily make it true or make it the case? Just because some things are culturally, morally relative, does that mean all things are culturally, morally relative? Now, if you believe that culture does in fact determine moral rights and wrongs, and I did, right? I changed my mind. But if you believe that all things are culturally, morally relative, then think about it for just a moment. Think about the 9/11, the events there at 9/11, when the Muslims used those airplanes and crashed into the Twin Towers there in New York City, and the thousands of people who lost their lives. Now, if it is the case that culture determines moral rightness and wrongness, then it was the right thing for those terrorists to do. It was the right thing for them to do because their culture taught them to do it. Now, that doesn't mean that all Muslims believe that it was right, but the culture that that group of individuals was part of did believe it was right. And since their culture believed it was right, it was right. Why? Because culture determines morality, therefore it was right for them to do it. Now, you can say that, well, but cultures shouldn't mix over into their cultures. Well, if that's the case, then think back to the 1990s in Rwanda, the 800,000 people who were killed for political reasons in Rwanda there in 1993, 94. Within 100 days, 800,000 men, women, and children were taken out and put into what we now call the killing fields of Rwanda, and they were slaughtered. And that all happened there within that country. Now, after a time and after so many deaths, the United States went in and stopped the killing. But if it's true that culture determines moral rights and wrongs, then if that culture there in Rwanda was teaching them that it's right to execute your political enemies, your political adversaries, if it's right to take them out into the field and kill them, then we couldn't have stopped. We shouldn't have stopped them. It was morally wrong for us to impose our cultural morals on another culture. So it wasn't wrong for them to kill all those people. It was right for them to kill all those people because that's what their culture taught. So if culture determines morality, what they did wasn't wrong, it was right, and they stayed within their own cultural boundaries as well. And so, morally, it was the right thing for them to do. And if culture determines morality, perhaps it was immoral for us to stop them for killing all of these people as well. So, does culture really determine morality? Well, if it's the case that culture determines morality, as many people believe, and this is also trying to show you how difficult it is, how do you even determine that something is part of a culture? Because culture in the United States as a melting pot is so convoluted and so mixed up. So let me kind of try to show you what I mean here. Imagine that you're from Texas and that that you're a warmonger who wants to create havoc and wants to create war in order to bring about a better global height of oil prices, right? And imagine that you become president of the United States, and then you declare war on, one of the Middle Eastern countries. Now, that's an idea that is perpetrated by many people about Bush and what he did. I don't think that's true, but what I'm saying here is that if it were the fact that he were raised by a Texas culture that was in fact warmongers, and that they somehow, since he got into that position of power, it wouldn't be wrong for him then to go out and declare war on the Middle East in order to bring oil prices up, because that's the culture he was raised in. I'm not saying that that's true. What I'm saying is that if that were the case, it wouldn't be wrong for him to do what he did, because that's what his culture taught him. If culture determines moral rights and wrongs, and if, as he's sometimes accused of, that description that I've given, it's not wrong for him to do what he did, because that's his culture. So if it's your culture, let's say you were raised in a Christian culture, and I understand not all Christians are raised in this culture, but let's assume that you're raised in this Christian culture where you're taught to hate homosexuals and hate atheists, then morally the right thing for you to do is to hate homosexuals and atheists. Why? Because that's the culture that you were brought up in, and if culture determines morality, it's the right thing for you to do. So what if you were raised by Nazis? If culture determines morality and you're raised by Nazis, you should go out and behave like a Nazi, because that's right. It's the right thing for you to do. If culture that you were raised in is a rapist culture, then behave like a rapist. If you were raised in a culture like the KKK, it's right for you to behave like members of the KKK. Why? Because culture determines morality, and that's the culture that you were raised in. So go behave as best you can like someone who is raised in and lives in the culture of the KKK. If culture determines morality, then those individuals behaving in those ways are actually doing